Thank you so much. It's really good to be home. And it's good to be campaigning for a guy that I will be proud to call senator. I tell my colleagues in Washington that you are going to be amazed when you find out the quality of the man that we're about to elect to the United States Senate. This is a guy who is among one of the best educated men or women who've ever run for public office, a guy who can preach a sermon and, as Martha's husband Tom would say, show you the sermon by acting it out. This is a guy who is the real deal. And I want to say I welcome all the elected members of the state legislature and as well as the county, as well as those who represent us statewide. And the labor leaders who have been my friends for a long, long time and always are there to help. And I also want to thank Martha Carper for being here. Martha, it's great to see you. Tom's down there trying to do something I wish the other guy would do, and that is control Wall Street and end the cowboy mentality that was at play and brought us to this position. But that's another reason why we need this fellow. Ladies and gentlemen, when I was sworn in along with Barack Obama, and by the way, Chris is right about Delaware and about our mutual affection for the state. There's an expression, I'm always getting kidded for quoting Irish poets, and Sonny Sloan knows I do it because of the best poets and not because I'm Irish. But there's a famous line that Joyce spoke. He said, when I die, Dublin will be written on my heart. Well, when I die, Delaware will be written on my heart. I owe this state so much. I owe it so much. And I don't just mean the votes. I don't mean the political help I've been given and the faith they placed in me. But so many things the people of this state, Democrat, Republican, Independent, have done for me and my family in difficult times and as well as the good times. I still can remember like it was yesterday, and it almost was, that train ride from not far from here down to Washington and seeing thousands of Delawareans standing along the railroad tracks so close to the track, it worried me that we actually slowed down, the train slowed down to, I don't know, 15, 20, 25 miles an hour because people were so close. And the expression on so many people's face. And I remember when we got there, that was on the 17th of January. And 3 days later, on that cold January day, when we were sworn in, Barack and me, standing before literally 1 million people on the mall, I looked out there as they asked me to raise my right hand, and I could see faces close up. And seeing the sense of anticipation and hope and expectation they had for us and for their country. But I also knew what they knew, that we were inheriting one god-awful situation. I got in trouble for saying early on that I referred to the recession as the Great Recession. What I meant by that, and now everybody calls it that, was literally accurate. This is the greatest recession we've ever had, short of a depression. And we came so perilously close. The worst economic recession in American history. We were hemorrhaging jobs. Before I lowered my hand on that cold day, Sam, 740,000 Americans had already lost their lives that month, just that month. 800,000 before we were sworn in. The economy, that first quarter we were in office, shrunk at 6.4%. It was in a nosedive, a 6.4% contraction of the world's greatest economy. Banks were in the moment of almost panic. We weren't talking about reorganizing the financial industry. The talk was about shuttering the doors of the major banking institutions in the United States of America. Some leveraged as much as 30-1, an outrageous circumstance. We found ourselves at, I think it was 26 months in a row, housing prices had plummeted, had dropped, the longest period in American history. And literally before Barack and I were able to open the desk drawers of our new desks in the West Wing, we were handed a bill for that year of $1.3 trillion in debt from the last administration, with a projected deficit of $5 trillion, before we did a single solitary thing. Not a single thing. We found ourselves in a position where the Democratic Party, when it turned over the keys to George W. Bush, handed him a check, figuratively speaking, of $230 billion in surplus for that year, with a projected surplus of $10 trillion over the next 10 years. Ladies and gentlemen, $5 trillion in the next 10 years. So now we get a debt of 1.3, $8 trillion projected, after having just 8 years earlier, $230 billion and a $5 trillion projected surplus. And we also inherited a foreign policy in disarray. Not only were our enemies doubting our capacity, but our friends as well. We found ourselves in a situation in Iraq where, as always, when the military moves, the surge was working, but there was no political progress being made, and there was no possibility of peace without political reconciliation. In Afghanistan, we inherited a war that had been essentially abandoned for 7 years. And Iran was marching toward a nuclear future of nuclear weapons, with the world blaming us for their actions. All in all, there were some mornings in those days when folks woke up to the news that serious economists were predicting Armageddon, a worldwide economic meltdown, a total collapse of the system America helped build. Everybody forgets this now, but you remember when the president first called a meeting of the G8, the issue was, would we be able to put anything together? Because this would become a worldwide recession. My deceased wife, who some of you knew, Nelia, used to have an expression. And I'd always say, she'd say, the ability of human beings to forget is the greatest gift God ever gave them. And my mother would say, yes, for were that not the case, women would only have one child. But it's amazing how quickly we have forgotten how bad things were, and it's good that the American people have moved beyond that, because we've moved beyond that. With all of that staring us in the face, we knew we couldn't dwell in the past. We asked for the job. We knew it was going to be tough, and we knew we were going to have to make some very, very difficult decisions. I love my Republican friends, particularly some in this state now, who in fact talk about we could have gotten out of this mess without making any hard decisions. I find that fascinating, absolutely fascinating. For why else would they sit in the sidelines and not offer one single hand? Think about it. All the difficult votes we had to take. Do you ever think of a time in your political memory where you could not find one single solitary Republican vote in the House of Representatives for anything? Not one single solitary vote. Assume for the sake of discussion we were wrong. It's hard to believe we were wrong so consistently and so universally that not one Republican. I know of at least 7 senators who I will not name, for they would be in jeopardy, who in fact agreed with us on almost every major initiative, but were made a commitment and required to make a commitment under threat of losing their chairmanships and other retribution they would face if they did not support the leadership on every procedural vote. Translated in English, that means every single thing we did, from the important to the not so important, required for the first time in modern American history 60 votes. All of a sudden, the majority became 60 out of 100, not 51 out of 100. Ladies and gentlemen, we knew if we looked to the future, we knew if we were bold enough, we knew if we thought about the next generation and not the next election, we could actually begin to make progress. I don't know how many times Barack and I spend a lot of time together at our private lunches. He said, look, I always wanted to be a former president of the United States. If that takes 4 years, that's okay. If it's 8, that's better. But we're going to do what we have to do. The thing I've admired about this guy is he has just stood up. He has a backbone like a ramrod, and he's made some very, very difficult decisions. But it's not like we didn't know they would be unpopular. It's not like when Tom led the fight for the Recovery Act, he didn't know it would be unpopular. Hard to explain to people why you had to go out and borrow almost $787 billion after just inheriting a $1.3 trillion debt in order to begin to prime the pump to keep people from falling into that abyss, giving people some hope, giving them the prospect that things would turn around. But we also knew we needed help. We also knew we needed help, not just the American people, who I believe were there, will be there, and will continue to be there. But we also needed help from political leaders, men and women who had a little bit of vision and a whole lot of toughness, who understood the complexity of the problems and understood that they were going to have to put the country ahead of their immediate self-interest. There isn't a politician in Washington that didn't know some of these votes initially would cost them politically. It's hard to explain to people that, in fact, voting for $787 billion has no impact on the long-term debt. It adds less than 1 percentage point of debt to GDP to the entire deal. But that's counterintuitive for people to understand. So we needed some people who, as I said, would put their immediate self-interest behind them and make difficult votes. We needed people who had the confidence to know that if we just had the will, we could get through these dark days and make them a whole lot brighter. Leaders with enough economic smarts, independent judgment, and just stand-up common sense to get us where we had to go. We needed leaders who have enough gumption and have demonstrated they're willing to exercise that gumption in times that are unpopular and that are difficult. We found them in the Democratic caucus in the person of Tom Carper, for real. We found them all across the Democratic spectrum. But you know what? That caucus needs some new momentum. That Democratic caucus needs some new ideas. We can't afford the same old in Washington. Ladies and gentlemen, we need exactly what Chris Coons stands for, what Chris Coons has demonstrated. I mean this literally, and what Chris Coons possesses. Ladies and gentlemen, Chris is a truly independent guy. He's a Democrat. He shares the same values we all share. But this is an independent guy who's smarter than most and has the willingness to take difficult decisions. He came to county executive in a pretty difficult time, if I'm not mistaken. The office was a mess, and Coons said that we're going to clean this place up. None of that was popular. It wasn't popular with labor. It wasn't popular with business. It wasn't popular with anybody. But everybody knows when there's no tough decision that has an easy answer. I haven't found one yet. So the people understood that this guy, even though some of the stuff he did wasn't popular, was necessary. And so what did he do? He cut $130 million in spending. He achieved a AAA bond rating while the rest of the country is heading in the drink. He imposed tough new ethics standards. He launched the Safe Streets Partnership to remove violators of parole from the streets, the ones most likely to commit those crimes. Ladies and gentlemen, the thing I like most about him, and Mom and Dad, the thing that I most admire about what you two produced was this guy gets it in his gut. You know, who goes to Yale and gets a law degree and a divinity degree? Somebody, first of all, who the hell goes to Yale? I don't know. My son, Huntworth, I haven't spoken to him since. I never liked those guys at Yale and Harvard. But all kidding aside, think about it. You know, when things are difficult, I trust the man or woman who arrives at the correct decision when it starts in their gut, moves to their heart, and then is articulated through their intellect as they process it. I appreciate those who are with me reaching just an intellectual conclusion, but when things get tough, they don't hang around. I really mean it. It's the guys who feel it in their gut. Well, this is a guy who feels it in his gut. This is a guy who understands an awful lot of Delawareans are still hurting. An awful lot of Delawareans are unnecessarily scarred by a recession that was not of their own making, which is why he's been so supportive of our efforts from the county level looking at us. He's been involved. He's been down to the Recovery Act. He's been deeply involved with the National Association of Counties. He has been engaged in this national effort because we have not, local officials have not brought this on themselves. This is a worldwide economic recession. And so he supported the Recovery Act. Right here in Delaware, that's already created 8,000 jobs, and we create more. 300,000 Delawareans, 300,000 Delawareans in the last year got a tax break of $200 million with the single biggest middle-class tax cut that almost went unnoticed because we didn't advertise it as part of the Recovery Act. But people got enough money to be able to get them through tough times. Not enough, but they got enough that made a difference in their lives. 650 teachers asked the governor, who would have otherwise gotten pink slips, taught, and school personnel taught and were involved last year because of the Recovery Act. Ladies and gentlemen, the 24 cops on the beat preventing untold crimes because of the Recovery Act that wouldn't otherwise be there. But where Chris's leadership has been especially vital is in getting our fiscal house in order like he did getting the county's fiscal house in order. Ladies and gentlemen, this guy knows how to balance a budget. And this guy understands the difference between short-term stimuli and long-term debt. Ladies and gentlemen, he's helped do it in Delaware, and he's going to bring that experience to Washington. Ladies and gentlemen, he watched, as I did and we all did, the last administration put two wars, a multi-trillion dollar, a $1.9 trillion tax cut, and billions of dollars prescription drug benefit, all on our kids' credit card without paying one single monthly payment. If you notice, both those wars, not once were they included in the regular budget. They were included in what they call a supplemental budget, so it wouldn't have to be counted as part of the budget. They did the same thing with the tax cut. It's not a wonder we inherited a $5 trillion projected debt because nothing of that scale was paid for. So, ladies and gentlemen, Chris supports what Tom has been pushing, a thing called PAYGO. We, in fact, put in place the Democratic Congress, and Chris is going to see it stays in place, a deal where if, in fact, you're going to spend money, you got to figure out what you're going to cut or where you're going to get the revenues, or you can't spend it. That's what got us where we were in the 90s, I want to tell you. And by the way, next time your Republican friends start talking about a deficit, say, name me the last Republican president that balanced the budget. Name me one. And I'll tell you, the hundreds of trillions of dollars, the tens of trillions of dollars in cumulative debt, Reagan of 8 years, Bush of 4, and Bush of 8 handed to us. The only president in modern history who's balanced the budget was a Democrat. His name was Clinton. We know how to balance budgets. You pay for what you offer. You make sure when things are tight like now, you do what this president did. Freeze the budget. Freeze the discretionary budget for the next 3 years, which alone will save well over $100 billion. And you do one other thing. You set in play, like we did to save Social Security in a bipartisan way then. You set in play the hard measures that are going to make you fiscally sound. Let me tell you what happened. The Republicans the 7 leading Republicans in the Senate co-sponsored a bill with Democrats calling for a commission, a statutorily required commission that required to put us on a path to balance the budget in the near term, requiring a report to the Congress before it went out of session, requiring a vote by the Congress. So the President and I agreed to support it. We put our weight behind it. The Democrats stepped up and voted for it. It failed by 5 votes. 7 Republican sponsors voted against exactly what they wrote, without one change in one word. That is a definition of hypocrisy. Absolute, unadulterated hypocrisy. So the President turned to me, and I remember talking to Chris about it on another matter. He said, "Joe, write me an executive order," because I had been negotiating that deal. I took their law, turned it into an executive order, requiring this commission to report before the Congress goes out, requiring the Congress to vote on what they recommend, requiring their recommendations to insist that we get to 3% of GDP, i.e. a balanced budget, taking in as much as we're getting out by the year 2015. And they opposed that too, but they couldn't do anything about it. It was an executive order. And we found some stand-up Republicans like former Republican Senator Al Simpson to chair this. Ladies and gentlemen, we got hard decisions to make because the long-term debt will balloon through entitlements. And that's the other reason why, Chris, when we talked about health care, it wasn't just the value of health care, it was the economic necessity. 47 cents on every single dollar that has been paid into health care is paid by the federal government for Medicare and Medicaid. And it's gone up 100%, 100% increase in an 8-year period. Totally unsustainable, an exponential curve. So the real reason, beyond the moral imperative of health care, we had to drive down cost to literally save our fiscal life. And so we did it. And what happened? The CBO points out, the Congressional Budget Office, that no one argues with their numbers. That in this next decade we'll save, and the long-term debt will cut it by $130 billion, and over the second decade by $1 trillion. That's the stuff of how you make government work. You stimulate where you have to, not impacting on the long-term debt, creating jobs, because Chris knows better than anybody. The only way out of this god-awful recession is through the free enterprise system, generating jobs. Jobs generate revenue. Revenue generates the ability to provide for everyone from our troops overseas to the basic needs we have. And nobody understands that more than Chris. So just take a look at what's happened just in the first 5 months of this year, after we've taken office. Instead of losing 3.2 million jobs as we did the first 5 months of last year, we actually created 495,000 private sector jobs. Instead of the economy tanking 6.4%, over the last 3 quarters, we've averaged a growth rate of over 4%, and all the blue chip indicators, notwithstanding Europe's situation, think we're going to grow at above 3% for the foreseeable future. Ladies and gentlemen, things are beginning to work, and the American people understand it. In Iraq, I'm heading to Iraq relatively soon for my 17th or 18th trip. The President put me in charge of making sure we got a political solution, and we kept our commitment. We will bring home by July 95,000 combat troops, keeping our promise. 95,000. There'll be 50,000 left, but they'll be in the hands of the Iraqis. Ladies and gentlemen, let me suggest to you that the reports of our demise, to paraphrase Samuel Clemens, are premature. First of all, there's going to be an awful lot that Chris is going to have to be able to run on beyond his own record. The contrast with guys like Chris and their opponents is stark. It's absolutely stark, and it's never been more stark and more exposed than it is today, right here in the state of Delaware and across the country. You know, Most Americans are a lot smarter and a lot tougher than either political party thinks they are. I don't think it's gone unnoticed that our Republican colleagues, while we've been going through this crisis, have literally sat on the sidelines and carped, sat on the sidelines and voted against their own initiatives because they've made a basic judgment, Chris. They believe the only way they can succeed is if we fail, when we believe the only way we can succeed is if we trust the American people and make some really tough decisions. So, ladies and gentlemen, take a look at what he brings. He brings energy, he brings a toughness, he brings an unbreakable commitment to getting things done. Well, the other team has decided the best thing to do is vote differently than you have the past 20 years. Go out there and make sure you say nothing that is controversial, and don't get yourself engaged in some of the really hard decisions that have to be made. Look, folks, Chris and I both know, like Tom does, there's still too much pain here in Delaware. There's too much pain throughout this country. But I think the American people also know that our Republican friends have done virtually nothing to help. I know what they're against, but have you heard anything that they're for? Have you heard what they would have done to stabilize the financial institutions of this country? Can you name for me what they have done that would have begun to revitalize industry in this country? Can you tell me what they've done and what they would do in order to make sure that we deal with the long-term debt by dealing with entitlements? Just go down the list. What are they for? I know what they're against. I mean this sincerely. What are they for? So, folks, Chris and the governor and I were speaking a moment ago in the back, and my grandpop used to have an expression, and you always kid me, my grandpop and pop had a lot of expressions, but it's true. He'd say, Joey, you have to have somebody to beat somebody. I would say you have to have an idea to beat an idea. They've offered no ideas. And folks, right now, those people who are worried and frightened because of what they've been through and what they're still engaged in, what they're still struggling to overcome. A lot of them are angry. But folks, come September, they're going to have to make a decision. They're going to have to start to look. You have to have somebody to beat somebody. What's the other team for? What have they delivered? By the time we roll around to this election, you're going to find that Sarah Palin's death panels have not materialized. Small business people are going to find they get a 35% tax credit for those people who they're paying for their portion of their health insurance now. They're going to find that, in fact, we're in a situation where you're already learning you can't disqualify a family for health care because their child has diabetes or a pre-existing condition. They're going to find that they're able to keep their 23 and 24-year-old child on their health care policy when they have no alternative as a practical matter. They're going to find that people are keeping their insurance at lower cost and they're not being thrown off the rolls. Ladies and gentlemen, they're also going to find that, in fact, we're going to continue to increase jobs. We're going to continue to build jobs. You know, I find it fascinating, everybody who showed up at the GM plant when Fiscal, in fact, took over to claim about how they didn't want government involved when it was a $450 million loan from the federal government that was engineered in order to keep that plant going, that will ultimately employ over 1,000 people, up to 2,000 people, making a good wage you can raise a middle-class family on. I find it fascinating they show up at the ribbon cuttings for the things that Tom and Mike and Ted Kaufman are out there because they voted for it. In fact, opening new roads, highways, buildings, classrooms, etc. Folks, the American people will be able to see through this. The people of Delaware will be able to see through this. I may not be good at much, but I've been pretty good at Delaware politics and figuring out the people in my home state. They're a lot smarter, as I said, than anybody gives them credit for. And you know, as I see it, as Chris sees it, it's really not, this is going to sound like hyperbole, but it really is not about the next election. It's about the next generation. It literally is about the next generation. And there's no easy way to right the ship these guys almost sunk. And folks, if we take care of the next generation, I promise you, the next election is going to take care of itself. So I'm here to tell you, America's on its way back, Delaware's on its way back, and Chris Coons is on his way to Washington. Thank you for helping him. Thanks for everything. I appreciate it.